Hello. You're on the channel where we don't talk in myths and cliches, but about how real politics works behind the facade of loud statements. In one of our earlier videos, we argued that Russia's economy cannot endlessly sustain the war in its current format. And we predicted that by autumn, the Kremlin would begin to face resource shortages to continue hostilities. And now, just 15 days into September, analysis of Russia's actions already shows that this prediction was correct. To confirm this, let's begin not with direct statistics, but with indirect signs that clearly highlight the problem. I'm talking about the so-called tactic of low-level escalation that Russia began to employ in early September. What does this tactic mean? Its essence is to combine military pressure with political threats in order to force the West to at least partially ease sanctions and sit down at the negotiating table. These are steps that formally don't cross the red line, but they create an atmosphere of threat and uncertainty. What kind of steps are we talking about? Let's take a look. On the night of September 9th to 10th, between 19 and 23 Russian drones crossed into Polish airspace, depending on the source. Polish air defenses shot down several, at least 4 were destroyed, and airports in Warsaw, Lublin, and Rzesza temporarily restricted operations. Poland called the incident a direct violation of its border and triggered consultations under Article 4 of the NATO Charter. This was not a stray missile or an accidental strike. It looked like a planned action meant to test the alliance's reaction. Almost simultaneously, reports appeared that a Russian drone had entered Romanian airspace, reinforcing the impression of a broader campaign to probe NATO's eastern flank. At the same time, the Russian-Belarusian Zapad 2025 exercises kicked off. Within their framework, Russia launched a Circon hypersonic cruise missile. An MiG-31 aircraft armed with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles flew over the Barents Sea. Announcements of the drills also mentioned scenarios involving nuclear planning and the Oreshnik system. Considered nuclear capable, Poland preemptively closed its border with Belarus, citing security concerns. In response, the Russian Foreign Ministry demanded immediate reopening of the checkpoints, claiming that the closure harmed trade and violated international norms. We see a classic pattern. First a threat is created, and then the victim is accused of escalation. Viewed together, these events are guided by a single logic. The economy is overstretched, resources are shrinking, spending is growing, and the Kremlin is trying to compensate for internal strain through external pressure. The goal here is not to win a direct military clash with NATO, that's impossible, but to create an atmosphere of fear and pressure, hoping that Western elites will prefer a frozen conflict to new risks. The Kremlin is trying to plant the idea, if you don't yield, we're ready to raise the stakes. But this tactic reveals weakness more than strength. Strong player dictates terms from resources. A weak one is forced to rely on constant threats, and here it's important to pause. Because all of these demonstrative steps, drone overflights, nuclear rhetoric during exercises, diplomatic pressure on Warsaw, look impressive. But in reality, they say less about strength than about weakness. They are attempts to cover internal problems with external noise. And if you strip away the political show and look at the facts, the main reason behind the Kremlin's nervous activity becomes clear: the rapid exhaustion of resources. Let's start with the most striking example. Russia has approached Ankara with a proposal to buy back the S-400 systems it sold Turkey in 2019. Experts explain it simply: stocks of modern air defense systems are running short. With many already committed to combat and training operations, this is a rare case where Moscow is essentially admitting its own shortage, and that's only the first signal. Another factor, increasingly obvious this autumn, is the shortage of resources for continuing the war. And here we're talking not only about the economy as a whole, but about specific sectors: drones, ammunition, fuel, and finance. Back in spring 2025, Vladimir Putin publicly admitted that despite increased production, Russian forces still lacked drones, including loitering munition models. At the time, he spoke of more than 1.5 million units produced in 2024, but it wasn't enough. And by autumn, we see his words confirmed. Frontline demand is growing faster than the defense industry can supply. Mass nightly drone strikes continue, but they are limited to hundreds of units, while the stated ambitions remain unattainable. As for ammunition, Western analysts in summer noted that Russia had significantly reduced the intensity of its artillery fire. This was linked to Ukrainian strikes on depots and plants. In autumn, the trend only deepened. Conservation of shells became obvious. Where barrages were once indiscriminate, now fire is more precise, signaling that replenishment no longer matches losses. Russia is also struggling with armor and manpower. International institutes had already noted heavy losses in tanks and armored vehicles earlier this year. By autumn, the problem is sharper. New deliveries exist, but they don't cover the attrition. Non-combat specialist drivers, reservist gunners, rear personnel are being sent to the front. This is a direct result of a shortage of trained troops. Energy is another telling case. At the Eastern Economic Forum in early September, Putin declared that Russia has nearly 1,000 years of coal reserves. He emphasized that the domestic market should rely more heavily on coal, especially in the Far East, to offset gas shortages. This is not just about promoting coal, but about admitting that even the so-called gas superpower may not have enough gas at home. The leadership is ready to substitute gas with coal where possible to compensate for deficits. There are several reasons. First, gas exports to Asia are rising. The Kremlin needs foreign currency to finance the war, leaving the domestic market less profitable. Second, strikes on energy infrastructure and the aging gas pipeline system limit supply to regions, particularly Siberia and the Far East. Third, the war has driven up industrial and military demand, creating competition for resources. And finally, sanctions hinder the development of new fields and access to technology, restraining output growth. All of this forces Russia, despite holding the world's largest gas reserves, to fall back on coal as a basic reserve fuel. Oil isn't doing better. Strikes on Russian refineries in spring and summer knocked out part of capacity. By autumn, the effects are in full view. Up to 13% of refining remains offline. While some regions face shortages of gasoline and diesel, in certain cases, coal had to be used as a stopgap indicator that the damage hits not only civilian life but also military supply. Waging war is no cheap endeavor. By June 2025, Russia's oil and gas revenues had dropped about 33.7% year-on-year. By autumn, the finance ministry reported that in the first 7 months, revenues were down 19 to 20% from last year. The federal budget showed a deficit of 3.694 trillion rubles in the first half alone. Meanwhile, in the 2025 budget, defense and security are set to take up around 41% of all spending, making war the clear priority of the expenditure side. That means Russia is living in an all-for war mode, leaving social programs in regions underfunded. Logistics are another pressure point. Ammunition depots and fuel bases hit in summer continued to be destroyed in autumn, becoming a systemic issue. Each strike burns through resources set aside for later, making frontline supply costlier and more difficult. We said back in summer that no economy can sustain the burden of war indefinitely, and now it's more obvious than ever. In August, the finance ministry cut its 2025 GDP growth forecast to 1.5%. Down from at least 2.5% projected in spring. This reflects weakness across several areas: shrinking exports, weak domestic demand, persistently high interest rates, and inflation pressing on every sector. The Bank of Russia's key rate remains at 17%, meaning business loans are unaffordable, investment is shrinking, and mortgages or consumer loans are becoming unattainable for households. The economy is in compression mode, and hiding this is no longer possible. The decline in oil and gas revenues is particularly telling. According to the finance ministry, in the first 7 months of 2025, they were almost 20% below last year. Seaborne oil exports have dropped to their lowest levels in a year, and the trend continues. These hard currency inflows had been used to cover ballooning military spending, but now that source is drying up. At the same time, the 2025 budget allocates over 13.5 trillion rubles to national defense, around 6.3% of GDP. This is a record for modern Russia, comparable only to Cold War-era Soviet levels. when the economy was far larger and could sustain the burden longer. Today, nearly half of budget spending goes either directly to the army or to related wartime sectors. Unsurprisingly, the budget deficit is growing. By mid-year, it had already reached 1.7% of GDP, surpassing planned targets. To plug the gap, the government has raised taxes. The corporate income tax rate increased from 20% to 25%. New levies were introduced on resource companies, and the progressive income tax was expanded. For businesses, this means higher costs and lower competitiveness. For the population, higher prices and fewer resources for daily life. What we see is an economy working at the limit. Ever more money goes to war. Ever less remains for development and social programs. All these trends show one thing: Russia is waging war at the edge of its capabilities. Yes, weapons production is growing, but the front consumes more than the country can replace. Admissions of drone shortages, reduced artillery fire, fuel disruptions, and a record deficit add up to a single picture. Autumn has only emphasized what was already clear in spring. Resources are depleting faster than they can be replenished. That is why we see Russia hardening its stance on the military and diplomatic fronts. At home, these moves are presented as shows of strength, but in reality, they look more like compensatory mechanisms. Taken together, the message is clear, behind the loud threats. The economy is strained, resources are dwindling, and the Kremlin is trying to offset domestic costs with external blackmail, hoping to frighten the West into talks. The West, meanwhile, responds cautiously, but its reaction is stiffening. NATO is reinforcing its eastern flank, sending more troops to Poland and the Baltics, and strengthening air defenses. The US and UK issue strong statements about readiness to defend allies. Article 5 of the NATO treaty has not been invoked yet, and everything remains within Article 4 consultations, allowing Moscow to play below the threshold. But here's an important new development. NATO has officially launched Operation Eastern Sentinel, aimed at strengthening the security of the eastern flank in response to Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace. Additional forces are already being deployed, with Denmark, France, the UK, and Germany participating. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had mentioned readiness for such a move days earlier, and now it's underway. The effect is the opposite of what Moscow intended. Instead of frightening the alliance, Russia has spurred NATO to consolidate and reinforce its presence. Another significant signal came from Washington. US President Donald Trump sent a letter to all NATO members, declaring readiness to impose the harshest sanctions on Russia, the condition that allies completely stop buying Russian oil. According to him, if NATO takes this step, the war will end quickly. Moreover, on his social media he wrote, "In any case, I am ready to begin when you are. Just tell me when." This shows Washington's resolve and simultaneously turns the issue into a test of NATO's unity. For Moscow, this is an alarming signal. A full halt of oil sales to NATO would be catastrophic for its budget. So what scenarios are possible next? The first is continued moderate escalation, more provocations, drone flights, large-scale drills, diplomatic blackmail. The second is a tougher NATO response, likely if incidents cause casualties or serious damage. This could mean permanent air patrols, more missile defense systems, and wider sanctions. The third is a freeze of the conflict, which Russia seeks. If Western capitals decide the risks are too high, which scenario is most likely? I believe the first, continued moderate escalation. Economic pressure and rising costs of war are driving the Kremlin toward intimidation tactics. Russia cannot sustain a long war without consequences, so its strategy boils down to buying time, forcing the West to blink, and securing a freeze. The key question is whether the West will resist this blackmail. If the EU and US stay united and continue pressure, Moscow's costs will only grow. If they concede, Russia could entrench its position and buy itself a few more years. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you value our approach without myths and cliches, trying to uncover how politics really works, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave your comments. This helps develop the project and push it into recommendations. And if you'd like to support the channel more directly, you'll find links in the description. Your support makes it possible to produce new analytical videos and stay independent. See you in the next episodes.